I was holding a cardboard box labeled kitchen when she said it. We were standing in the middle of her new apartment, the kind of place that still smells like fresh paint and someone else's decisions. Outside the window, the Ottawa River was dark and flat, the Gatineau Hills just a shadow on the other side. The box was heavier than it looked. She was watching me set it down on the counter, and when I straightened up, she was already looking away, like she had been about to say something and then thought better of it. Then she said it anyway. "You know, you were always the one I should have ended up with." I stood there with my hand still curved from the shape of the box, the city lights coming through the glass behind her, and I did not know what to do with those words. I still do not entirely. But I know that everything started 2 months earlier, on a Thursday night when I was sitting alone at my kitchen table eating leftover chisley and my phone rang with a number I did not recognize. My name is Owen Prescott. I am 38 years old. I work as a structural inspector for the city of Ottawa, which means I spend most of my days walking around bridges, parkades, and overpasses with a clipboard and a flashlight, looking for the kinds of problems that nobody wants to find. It is not glamorous work. The pay is public sector steady, which is different from good but not so different that you complain about it. I have a small house in Barrhaven that I bought 3 years ago because the mortgage payment was cheaper than rent, and my financial advisor, who is also my former college roommate, told me it was the right call. He was probably right. I have a truck, a workbench in the garage, and a dog named Clifford, who is shaped like a loaf of bread and takes up 3/4 of the couch. I have been divorced for 2 years. Her name was Sasha. We were married for 5 years, together for 2 before that. She was warm and bright and quick in the way that certain people are, the kind who walk into a room and immediately know what it needs. She was good at most things I was not. She was not good at quiet, not the comfortable kind anyway. She used to say that being with me was like watching a movie with the sound turned down, that she could see things happening but could not feel them the way she needed to. She did not say it to wound me. She just ran out of patience for what she called my way of disappearing into myself. The divorce was as clean as these things can be. No children, no contested property. We divided what we had, signed what we needed to sign, and then I moved into the Barrhaven house and she moved to Calgary for a job she had wanted for a long time. I think she is happy there. I genuinely hope she is. Her younger sister was named Danielle Kowalczyk, 3 years younger than me, 35. She had visited a few times when Sasha and I were still together, usually around Christmas or the long weekend in August when Sasha's mother organized family gatherings at the cottage on Lac Saint-Pierre. Danny was quieter than Sasha in the way that made sense if you understood that Sasha had always been the louder one. She worked as an occupational therapist at a rehab center in Montreal. She liked crossword puzzles. She always brought a book to family gatherings and drifted toward whatever corner of the room had the best light. I did not think much about her after the divorce. She belonged to that part of my life, the part that ended when Sasha and I stopped being married. Family lines are clear in that way. You do not reach across them without a reason. The phone call in October was her. I almost did not answer. Unknown number, 9:30 at night. But something made me pick up, and the voice on the other end was careful in that particular way of someone who has rehearsed the opening line. "Owen, this is Danny Kowalczyk. I'm sorry to call out of nowhere." I told her it was fine. I asked what she needed. She told me she had accepted a position at a rehabilitation clinic in Centretown. She was moving from Montreal to Ottawa and did not know anyone in the city. She needed help moving a few things from her storage unit in Gatineau across the river to her new apartment, and she knew I had a truck. She said she would completely understand if I said no. I thought about it for a few seconds. Helping your ex-wife's younger sister move. It sounded like exactly the kind of thing a person should probably decline. But her tone was matter-of-fact, not loaded, not angling for anything I could detect. She was someone who needed a hand, and I happened to have a truck and nowhere to be on a Saturday. So I said yes. The storage unit was in an industrial strip in Gatineau, off Boulevard de la Gap, the kind of place where the fluorescent lights buzz and the padlocks are all the same brand. She did not own much. A few boxes of books, a small wooden writing desk, a folded bicycle, a lamp with a bent shade that she clearly intended to keep anyway. We loaded everything in under an hour. I carried the desk and the heavier boxes. Danny wrapped her books individually in old issues of the Globe and Mail before stacking them in the boxes, which I had never seen anyone do before, and which told me something about her I could not quite name. On the drive across the Macdonald-Cartier Bridge, she asked me how I was doing since the divorce. I told her I was fine. She nodded and did not push. I asked her the same. She looked out the passenger window at the river below and said, "Montreal stopped making sense to me, so here I am." I did not push either. We drove the rest of the way mostly in silence, and it was the kind that did not need filling. Her apartment was on the 7th floor of a building on Lisgar Street, 10 minutes from Parliament Hill. The view was not spectacular, but there was a sliver of the canal visible from the living room window if you stood at the right angle, and the afternoon light came through the south-facing windows in a way that made the empty room feel less empty than it was. We unloaded, assembled the bed frame, got the desk up against the wall she pointed to. I noticed pretty quickly that she was methodical about everything, each box placed exactly where she wanted it before opening it, books organized not alphabetically but by subject, and then by author, which I recognized as the system of someone who has thought seriously about how they want to live inside their own head. At one point I was on my knees tightening a loose leg on her writing desk when I heard her stop moving behind me. I looked up. She was watching me work with an expression I could not read, the kind of look that passes across someone's face and is gone before you can decide what it meant. She turned back to her box and did not say anything. That was the first time I noticed the mug. It was in one of the kitchen boxes wrapped in a section of newsprint. Dark blue, ceramic, chipped on the handle, with a small white logo from a hardware store in Longueuil. It was the kind of mug that gets kept, not because it is special but because it has become specific. I set it on the counter without thinking much about it, and we kept unpacking. Over the next few weeks, I found reasons to go back. A curtain rod that needed mounting. A bathroom faucet that dripped. One evening I picked up butter chicken from a place on Bank Street because she mentioned that she had not figured out the neighborhood yet, and it seemed like the kind of thing a person said when they had been eating crackers and granola bars for 3 days straight. She opened the door in an oversized sweater with paint on the sleeve, which I later learned was from the watercolor class she took on Tuesday nights, and she looked genuinely surprised that I had come. Each time I visited, she made coffee. Not from a machine, but from a French press she clearly took seriously, with beans from a roastery in the glebe. She handed me a mug every time without asking how I took it. Always black. Always without sugar. She never mentioned knowing that was how I drank it. She just handed it over like there was nothing to mention. I noticed things about her the way you notice a change in the weather, not all at once. She kept a small notebook on the kitchen table and wrote in it every morning before work. Not a journal exactly, more like a list, things she had noticed, questions she had not answered yet. She knew I was left-handed before I told her. She remembered that I had mentioned, once years ago at a Christmas gathering, that I had wanted to study architecture before I went into structural engineering instead, and she asked about it one evening with the ease of someone retrieving a fact they had filed carefully away rather than come across by accident. These were not casual observations. You do not remember a detail like that from a single dinner conversation 3 or 4 years earlier unless you were paying attention in a way that was different from ordinary attention. She never made a production of it. She brought it up the way you might mention the weather outside, easily, naturally, like it would be strange not to know. One evening we were on her small balcony, the temperature doing that thing it does in November in Ottawa where it is technically above zero but the wind off the canal convinces your body otherwise. She had brought out a wool blanket that she draped over her own shoulders and then, without ceremony, extended the edge of it toward me. I shifted my chair closer and she tugged the blanket across both our laps and did not look at me when she did it. We sat there watching the street below and she said, in a tone that was almost too offhand to be casual, "Do you miss being married, or do you miss who you were when you were married?" I did not answer right away. It was the kind of question that deserves more than a quick answer. "Different things," I said finally. She nodded like that made complete sense. Then she looked back at the street. "I think some people miss the version of themselves that had someone to come home to," she said. Even if the person wasn't right. I assumed she was speaking generally, the way people do on cold balconies after a glass of wine. I let it pass. A few days later, I was helping her reorganize a storage closet in her hallway. At the back, behind a folded yoga mat and a box of winter gear, I found a shoebox held shut with a rubber band. I was reaching past it for the shelf bracket she needed when she appeared beside me and took it from not roughly, but quickly. She tucked it under her arm and said, "Old stuff," and her voice had something in it that was not quite steady. I did not ask. But the question settled somewhere in the back of my mind and did not leave. What does a woman who just moved across province have in a rubber-banded shoebox that she does not want another person to see? 3 weeks later, I was replacing the switch plate on her living room wall when she said, completely unprompted, "You always measure twice before you cut anything." I lowered the screwdriver and looked at her. "How do you know that?" She shrugged, one of those small shrugs that try to pass as casual and do not quite manage it. "I pay attention." She went back to her notebook. I went back to the switch plate. But the way she had said it did not let go of me for the rest of the evening. There was a weight underneath it. Not the weight of something flirtatious, but of something that had been held for a long time and shifted slightly in the holding. It was about 6 weeks after the move that everything changed. I was sitting in my house on a Sunday evening, Clifford taking up his usual portion of the couch, a hockey game on low in the background, when my phone lit up. The name on the screen was the last name I expected to see. Sasha. Her voice when I answered was familiar, in the way that something no longer part of your daily life still carries the exact texture you memorized. Control, efficient, precise. The voice of someone who had thought carefully about what she wanted to say and had said it before saying it. "What's going on with you and Danny?" "No, hello." I told her the truth. I had helped her sister move. I had been over a few times to help with things around the apartment. That was it. Sasha made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "Owen, come on. You know Danny doesn't do anything without a reason." She paused, and then she dropped something into the conversation that she had clearly been saving. She told me that Danny had, years ago in Montreal, developed feelings for someone she was not supposed to love. A colleague, a man who was in a complicated situation, and the situation had damaged both of them badly. The whole thing had ended with Danny leaving the job, losing the friendship group, starting over somewhere else. Sasha delivered this information in the careful voice of someone performing concern while actually performing something else entirely. I knew how to read Sasha. I had been married to her for 5 years. She was not telling me this to protect me. She was telling me this because somewhere in the arithmetic of her own story, if I ended up with her quieter sister, if the silence she had called a deficiency turned out to be exactly what someone else had been searching for in a person, it would mean something had been miscalculated. And Sasha did not miscalculate. That was the story she lived inside. I told her I appreciated the call. I meant it neutrally and she heard it that way and we hung up. But it settled into me anyway, the way small doubts do, not loud, just present. The next time I went to Danny's apartment, something in me had shifted a few degrees. I stood on the other side of the kitchen. I did not stay for coffee. I fixed the curtain rod she had asked about and said something about an early inspection in the morning, and left while the French press was still steeping on the counter. It was subtle. I measured it in inches. But Danny noticed. She did not say anything. She did not confront me or try to close the distance I had created. She just changed. Her eyes had the quality of someone who recognizes the beginning of something being withdrawn and has learned, through practice, not to chase it as it goes. 2 weeks after that, Sasha showed up in Ottawa. She did not warn either of us. She flew in on a Friday, took a cab from the airport to Danny's building on Lisgar, and knocked on the door on a Saturday afternoon while I happened to be inside her apartment installing a new smoke detector in the hallway. When Danny opened the door and saw her sister standing in the corridor, every bit of color left her face. Sasha walked in the way she always moved through a room, purposefully, like the space reorganized itself around her arrival. The three of us stood in Danny's living room, the November light flat and gray through the windows, the canal a dull silver in the distance. The temperature in the room dropped. Sasha turned to Danny. Her voice was the one I remembered from the hardest arguments of our marriage. Calm on the surface, clinical underneath. "Tell him, Danny. Tell Owen that you requested a transfer to Ottawa, or any of the other places that were offered to you. Tell him how long ago you put in for that specific posting. Tell him why you called him instead of hiring movers, or asking literally anyone else you know." Every word was true. That was the thing about Sasha. She was never inaccurate. She was a weaponized fact, aimed with precision. Danny went very still. She stood in the middle of her own apartment and did not deny a single thing. She looked at the floor for what felt like a full minute. Then she looked up at Sasha, not at me, at her sister, and she said, quietly and without flinching, "You're right, but you're saying it like it's a crime." Then she turned to me. She apologized. Not for her feelings. She apologized for not telling me the truth about why she had called that night in October, for framing it as logistics, when it was always something else. Her voice was steady, slightly formal, the voice of someone who had rehearsed this moment in private more than once. Then, she crossed to the kitchen counter, picked up the dark blue mug with the hardware store logo, and set it on the table between us. She turned and walked to the window, stood there with her back to both of us, arms crossed, looking out at the canal. I looked at the mug. The hardware store logo was from Longueuil. She had not lived in Long, she had lived in Plateau Mont Royal, which was on the opposite side of the city. There was no reason for her to have a mug from a hardware store in Longueuil, unless she had been somewhere specific, for a specific reason, at a specific time. I turned it over in my hands. On the bottom, written in permanent marker in handwriting I had seen before, my own handwriting from years ago on a Christmas label, were two initials, O.P. I had been at that hardware store in Longueuil once, years ago, on a drive that Sashi and I had taken to visit her grandmother in Brossard, and the car had made a sound it should not have made, and I had pulled into the nearest parking lot, which happened to be next to a hardware store where I bought a socket set and a bottle of water. Danny had been in the back seat. I had not thought about that afternoon in years. She had found the mug on the clearance shelf. I had made a small joke about buying a mug from a hardware store, which I could barely remember making. She had bought it anyway later from the same store. She had written my initials on the bottom in permanent marker. She had carried it from Montreal to Ottawa. Sasha was still in the room. I could feel her waiting. She had her arms folded, her chin raised in the particular way that meant she had already decided how this ended and was waiting for the world to catch up. I stood there for 15 seconds. Then I looked at her and said, "You didn't come here to protect me. You came here to protect the ending you gave yourself." She opened her mouth, then she closed it. It was perhaps the only thing I had ever said to Sasha that she had no immediate answer for. She stood there for a moment with something crossing behind her eyes, something raw and unfinished, and then she picked up her bag and walked to the door and pulled it shut behind her without another word. The latch clicked. The apartment was very quiet. I walked to the window where Danny was standing. She was looking out at the canal, her arms still wrapped around herself, her shoulders drawn up slightly against nothing in particular, the way a person holds themselves when they are waiting for the next bad thing. I stood beside her, close enough to be next to her, not close enough to reach for her before she was ready. "The mug," I said. She did not look at me right away. When she did, her eyes were steady, which told me how much effort that was costing her. "That afternoon in Longueuil," she said, "you were under the hood of the car in the parking lot and you had grease on your knuckles and you were humming something. I don't even know what. You probably didn't know you were doing it. And Sasha was on her phone 10 feet away, and you were completely absorbed in the problem in front of you. You didn't even register that she wasn't helping. You just fixed it on your own, without making it into anything." She paused. "I went back and bought the mug the following week. I don't know why. I just wanted something from that afternoon. And then she told me everything. She told me slowly, the way you empty a room you have lived in for a long time. She had noticed me before I was her sister's husband. She had met me once, briefly, at an engagement party for a mutual friend years ago, before Sasha and I were anything. She had forgotten my last name but not my face. Then Sasha brought me home, and she understood immediately, and she made the only decision that was available to her, which was to say nothing, to attend the family gatherings and pass the salad, and excuse herself early to go read in a corner of the cottage where she did not have to watch me pour Sasha's wine. She spent 5 years of holidays and long weekends being careful, being unreadable, being the quiet one in the corner who was always thinking about something else. Because the alternative was to be visible in a way that would have cost everyone something. When Sasha and I divorced, Danny told herself it was not her business. She told herself 2 years was enough distance. She told herself that accepting the posting in Ottawa was about the job, and the job was real and the opportunity was genuine. But the geography was a choice she had made for reasons she had not fully admitted even to herself, until she was already unpacking boxes on Lisgar Street and calling a man with a truck. "I wasn't trying to step in the moment the door opened," she said. Her voice was thin and precise, like a sentence she had measured carefully before saying out loud. "I just wanted to be in the same city. I thought maybe that was enough to start with." I looked out at the canal. A cyclist crossed the bridge below in the gray November light. Clifford was at home, probably on the couch, probably waiting. I thought about everything I had registered over the past 2 months. The way she handed me coffee without asking. The way she knew I measured twice. The way she had brought up the architecture school remark without any preamble, as if she had simply been holding it somewhere safe. None of it was accidental. None of it was casual. It was the accumulated attention of someone who had been paying close attention for a long time, not because they were waiting to use it for something, but because paying attention was how they loved. "I don't see what Sasha wanted you to be afraid of," I said. Danny turned to look at me. "I see someone who bought a hardware store mug and wrote initials on the bottom and carried it across 2 provinces." She said nothing. Her fingers unclenched slightly at her sides. I went back inside and picked up the mug from where she had left it on the table. I carried it back to the window and set it on the ledge between us, where she could see it. "Keep it," I said. "But next time, you're allowed to say something sooner." The corner of her mouth moved, the smallest possible smile, the kind that takes a lot to hold back. Nothing dramatic happened after that. That is the honest version. I drove home that evening. I went to work Monday morning. I ate lunch at my desk and watched it snow through the window and did not call anyone. That night I sat on the couch with Clifford and thought for a long time about what it meant to have something offered to you that you had not known to look for. The following Thursday evening I sent Danny a message. Simple. "There's a new Ethiopian place on Elgin. I have no one to go with," she replied 40 minutes later. "I've been trying to figure out that neighborhood." 7:30? We sat at a small table in the back, the restaurant warm and loud around us, injera arriving in a wide basket with 6 small servings arranged around the edge. We talked more that evening than we had in all the previous weeks combined. Not about Sasha, not about any of it. About her work, the patients she was helping relearn how to use their hands after strokes, the satisfaction of watching someone regain something they thought was gone for good. About my job, the bridges I walked every week, the quiet pleasure of understanding why something holds and why something fails. About Ottawa winters and whether a person could ever really make peace with them. We were at the table for 2.5 hours. She laughed 3 times in a way that meant she had forgotten to manage her expression, and I found that I wanted to keep going until she forgot again. The weeks that followed were not a romance in any cinematic sense. There were no grand declarations. What there was instead was this. I started stopping at the coffee roastery in the Glebe on my way across town, not because she had asked me to, but because I had noticed the beans were getting low. She texted me one afternoon with a photo of a bookshelf she was trying to anchor to the wall, and the question wasn't, "Can you help?" It was, "Does this stud location look right to you?" which told me she already knew she was right and just wanted to share the problem with someone. I drove over anyway. We ordered pizza and she read me the first chapter of a novel she was considering for her own reading, and I sat on her floor and listened and thought that this was what I had been unable to name before. Her crossword book appeared on my coffee table one weekend and then lived there. Clifford, who disliked most strangers, walked directly to her the first time she came to the house in Barhaven and put his chin on her knee and sighed. Danny looked down at him, and then up at me with an expression that said she understood this was a meaningful endorsement. I stopped keeping track of how many evenings ended with neither of us wanting to be the one to leave first. Sasha called once more, 3 months later. Her voice was different. Some of the precision had gone out of it, replaced with something flatter and less defended. "You and Danny are actually doing this." "We are," I said. There was a long silence. I could hear her breathing. Then she said, "I think I needed her to be small so the leaving made sense. But she's not small, is she?" It was not a question. It was the kind of thing a person says when they are finally telling the truth to themselves out loud. I did not know what to say, so I said, "No, she's not." Another silence, then okay, and that was it. We hung up, and I stood in my kitchen for a moment, listening to the house settle around me, the particular quiet of a winter night in Barhaven, the furnace running underneath everything, and I felt something ease in my chest that I had not realized was still held tight. 6 months after that first Ethiopian dinner, Danny and I stopped treating her apartment and my house as separate centers of gravity. There was no conversation about it. It happened the way furniture settles when you stop moving it around and let it find where it belongs. Her bicycle appeared in my garage. A second key appeared on the hook by my front door. Clifford learned to sleep in a way that accommodated 3 bodies on a couch designed for 2. One evening in early spring I was fixing the leg on her writing desk, which had gone loose again in the move between buildings. The same leg, the same wobble, persistent in the way certain small problems are. I was on the floor with a screwdriver when Danny came out of the kitchen and crouched down beside me. She did not hand me a tool. She just stayed there, close, watching the way I worked. Not saying minute, she said, "You know what I noticed the very first time you came over? You fixed the thing without asking what tools I had. You went down to the truck and got what you needed and came back and just did it." "It was a loose leg," I said. "I know what it was." She was quiet for a moment. "But that's not nothing. That's actually kind of everything." I tightened the last screw. I did not say anything because I did not need to. She already knew. I found the shoebox eventually. Not because I went looking. We were reorganizing the storage closet in the Barhaven house, making room for her winter things, and it was there on the top shelf, still held shut with the same rubber band. I did not open it, but I noticed, sitting on top of the lid, held in place by the rubber band, a photograph I had not seen before, a snapshot taken at arm's length, the kind you take quickly when you do not want the moment to end but know it will. It was from a Christmas gathering, several years back at Sasha's mother's cottage. I was in the background, turned away from the camera, carrying a folded kayak down to the dock by myself in the evening light. I had not known anyone had taken it. I put it back exactly where it had been. That evening I made dinner. Roast chicken with roasted root vegetables, the November staples carrots and parsnips, and one sweet potato that Danny had bought at the Byward Market and left on the counter with no direction. She sat at the kitchen table with her notebook and wrote in it while I cooked. Clifford slept on the mat by the back door. The windows fogged slightly from the oven. The radio was on low, a CBC program about rivers that neither of us was really listening to. At some point she looked up from her notebook. "What?" "Nothing," I said. "Just this." She looked at me for a moment with an expression I had come to know. Something specific to her, the look of someone who has been braced for disappointment long enough that the absence of it still requires a moment to register. Then she went back to her notebook. I went back to the chicken, and that was enough. That was more than enough. The small wooden desk in the next room, the bicycle in the garage, the mug on the counter with my initials on the bottom in permanent marker, the sound of her writing at the kitchen table while I kept my hands busy with something useful. I used to think that needing quiet was the same as having nothing to say. Sasha said so plainly enough, and I believed her for longer than I should have. But Danny did not need me to fill the room. She needed someone who would go down to the truck to get the right tool without being asked, who would come back and fix the problem and sit with her afterward in the comfortable kind of silence, the kind that does not require explanation. Love does not always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives as a mug from a hardware store in Longueuil with two initials on the bottom. Sometimes it sits quietly in the back seat while everything else happens in the front, and waits and carries what it feels across distance and time and across whatever geography is required, without asking you to notice until finally do. She never asked to be seen first. She just made sure that when I finally looked, I would understand what I was looking at.